The sterile conference room air felt like a physical blow. Frank Olson, his face a mask of practiced regret, slid the termination papers across the polished table. My career, built over 2 decades, evaporated with his dismissive wave. Gary Jenkins watched, impassive, as I became just another failed statistic. Some gambles, Frank said, a cold smile playing on his lips, aren't worth the bet. The recycled air of the Singapore Airlines flight had done little to clear the knot in Ethan Miller's stomach. Chicago loomed ahead, not as a homecoming, but as an impending judgment. He touched down early in the morning, the city skyline a familiar, unwelcoming silhouette against the gray dawn. He went straight to his hotel, a place he knew too well, then to the gym. The treadmill hummed beneath his feet, a monotonous rhythm he matched with his breathing. Sweat slicked his skin, a temporary shield against the chill he felt inside. After 30 minutes, he stepped into a cold shower, letting the icy water sting his skin, a practiced Midwestern stoicism he had cultivated since college. He needed to be sharp, even if the edges of his world were crumbling. By 9 o'clock, he was at the J.P. Morgan offices, the polished lobby a testament to enduring wealth. The assistant, a new face he didn't recognize, led him down a quiet corridor to conference room 3. The door was already ajar. Frank Olson and Gary Jenkins sat at the long polished table. Frank, the head of the investment council, had his hands clasped, his expression neutral. Gary, the firm's lead counsel, merely watched as Ethan entered. The room was sterile, the only sound the low hum of the ventilation system. It felt less like a meeting and more like an interrogation. "Ethan," Frank began, his voice surprisingly soft. "Have a seat." Ethan pulled out a chair, the leather squeaking softly. He didn't bother with small talk. Frank wasted no time either. "What the hell happened in Singapore, Ethan?" Frank's tone sharpened, losing its initial softness. "That aquaculture company. We gave you latitude, we gave you resources. We certainly didn't authorize that kind of reckless investment." Ethan felt the familiar prickle of defiance. He'd seen the opportunity, analyzed the data, believed in the long-term play. "It wasn't reckless, Frank. It was a calculated risk. The growth potential for sustainable protein in Southeast Asia is massive. I outlined it all. It's all in my report." He gestured to the folder he'd sent weeks ago, the one that had been summarily dismissed. Frank leaned forward, his patience clearly thin. "Your report was wishful thinking, Ethan." The council reviewed it. "Your projections were optimistic, at best. The volatility in that market, coupled with your aggressive position, exposed the firm to unacceptable risk." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "The council voted this morning. We're letting you go." Gary cleared his throat, pushing a thick envelope across the table. "This is your severance package, Ethan. It's generous, considering the circumstances. 3 months' salary, plus an additional 6 months for your years of service. Standard non-disclosure and non-compete clauses, of course." He tapped the envelope. "It's substantial, enough to get you back on your feet. Enough to get him back on his feet, perhaps, but not enough to erase the stain of being fired." Ethan looked at the papers, the terms laid out in cold, legalistic language. A substantial sum, yes, but at the cost of his reputation, his standing, everything he had built. He picked up the pen Gary offered, feeling an unsettling void open up inside him. His hand was steady as he signed his name on the designated lines. He then slid his company ID card, his laptop, and his office keys across the table. Frank nodded once, a final definitive gesture. He walked out of the building into the biting Chicago air. The city was in full swing, yellow cabs rushing past, pedestrians hurrying to their destinations. Ethan Miller, 42 years old, stood on the sidewalk, suddenly unmoored. Too young to retire, too old to easily start over. The weight of the severance package in his bag felt less like a lifeline and more like a heavy burden. Back in his hotel room, the quiet was oppressive. He stared at the 4 walls, then at the envelope Gary had given him. The numbers swam before his eyes. He had personal savings too, a decent amount tucked away. A thought, desperate and bold, began to form. He wouldn't just use this money to find a new job. He would use it to prove them all wrong. He would gamble. He went online, ordered a new anonymous laptop, had it delivered to the hotel within the hour. He set up an offshore trading account, a clean slate, away from the prying eyes of Wall Street and its councils. He pulled up the charts for the Singaporean aquaculture company. The stock had dipped further since his dismissal, a knee-jerk reaction. He saw it not as a failure, but as an opportunity, a deeper discount. He began the wire transfers, first his personal savings, then the full amount of his anticipated severance. Every dollar he possessed, every last cent of his professional life, poured into the high-risk investment. When the transfers were complete, a strange mix of relief and terror washed over him. He felt hollowed out, but also strangely free. He looked at his phone, a dozen missed calls from his wife, his parents. He switched it off. The reckoning could wait. He needed to breathe. The early morning light filtered through the hotel room curtains, but Ethan's internal clock was still ticking to Singapore time. He'd slept fitfully, the phantom weight of his massive gamble pressing down on him. The stock market was closed, offering a brief reprieve from the numbers, but the anxiety remained. He reached for his phone, switched it on, and watched as a torrent of messages flooded the screen. Most were from Kyle and Sarah, his kids. "Dad, where are you?" One from Kyle, read. "Mom's really upset." Another from Sarah hours later. "Help, Dad, Mom is having a breakdown. She won't talk to us." Brenda, his wife of nearly 20 years, was conspicuously absent from the notification list. No birthday wish, not even a simple check-in after his long flight. Just silence. It was her silence that truly unnerved him. He booked the first flight to Springfield. The hours-long journey across the Midwest, a blur of flat fields and small towns. Each mile brought him closer to a home he suddenly felt estranged from. The mundane drone of the plane engines only amplified the growing knot of dread in his stomach. He tried to read to distract himself, but the words blurred, overshadowed by the images forming in his mind. When he finally pulled into the driveway, the familiar two-story house looked different. Not outwardly, but the air around it felt heavy. He unlocked the front door. The silence inside was immediate, thick. The entryway was cluttered, something unusual for Brenda. A half-eaten bag of chips lay on the floor next to Kyle's backpack. Sarah's art supplies were scattered across the dining room table, alongside a few empty soda cans. The whole place felt neglected, a thin film of dust on surfaces usually pristine. He walked into the kitchen and his stomach tightened. The sink was full of dirty dishes, a crust of dried food on plates. The dishwasher, half open, was overflowing with clean dishes that hadn't been put away. The trash can bulged, a forgotten pizza box perched precariously on top. This wasn't Brenda, not the Brenda he knew. She was meticulous, almost obsessively so, about the house. He moved into the living room, the uneasiness deepening. On the coffee table, amidst a pile of magazines and a forgotten remote, stood two empty wine bottles. One was a cheap Merlot, the other a slightly more expensive Sauvignon Blanc. Next to them, two stem glasses, unwashed. He picked one up, a faint, smudged smear of red lipstick. He picked up the other, a different shade, a lighter pink. He set them down carefully, his heart a cold, hard stone in his chest. Upstairs, the master bedroom offered no reprieve. The bed was unmade, the sheets tangled. The faint, sweet smell of a woman's perfume, not Brenda's usual scent, hung in the air. He stripped the bed, bundling the sheets and pillowcases into a tight knot. The mattress beneath seemed to sag more than usual. He cleaned the space methodically, wiping down surfaces, vacuuming the rug, trying to impose order where there clearly was none. Each movement was deliberate, a way to channel the growing unease, to delay confronting the stark reality that was slowly revealing itself. Hours passed. The house began to resemble its old self, though the underlying tension remained. Exhausted, he finally sat down at the kitchen counter, pulled out his new laptop. He needed to check the market, a desperate anchor in the storm. The aquaculture stock was down another 3%. He watched the red numbers, the digital representation of his dwindling fortune. "We'll see what kind of balls I have," he muttered to the empty room, his voice hoarse. He called his father Hank, a farmer in rural Illinois, whose gruff wisdom he often sought. "Hey, Dad, I'm home." "Ethan, good to hear from you, son. Brenda's been not herself." Hank paused, a heavy silence hanging on the line. "She's been awful sad, depressed, said she was heartbroken, but she wouldn't say why." Ethan thanked him, hung up. the words heartbroken echoing in his ears. Heartbroken? For no clear reason? He logged into their joint bank account, meticulously scrolling through the transactions. Groceries, utility bills, the kids' school fees. Nothing overtly unusual, no lavish purchases, no suspicious cash withdrawals. Yet, the domestic came, Brenda's silence, the wine bottles, the lipstick marks, they spoke volumes, a narrative forming in the quiet Midwestern home he no longer recognized. The clock on the kitchen wall read 7:15 p.m. when Brenda's car finally pulled into the driveway. Ethan stood by the window watching her switch off the engine. The engine's silence felt heavy. She walked to the front door, her shoulders hunched. When she stepped inside, her eyes scanned the meticulously cleaned living room, then darted to Ethan. She avoided his gaze, her usual easy smile absent, replaced by a strained, distant expression. "Hi," she said, her voice thin, almost a whisper. She dropped her purse on the console table, then headed straight for the kitchen, opening the refrigerator as if searching for something important. Ethan followed her, his voice low, measured. "Brenda, we need to talk." She closed the refrigerator door. "Talk about what? I've had a long day. The kids are probably hungry." She made a vague gesture towards the living room, where Kyle and Sarah were watching TV, oblivious to the tension. "About everything," Ethan said, his voice flat. He looked around the now clean kitchen, the lingering scent of disinfectant failing to mask the coldness in the air. "About you, about the house." Brenda turned, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. "What about the house? Looks fine to me." "It wasn't fine earlier. It was a mess. And your father told me you've been heartbroken." "What's that about?" He kept his voice even, trying to keep the anger from showing. He picked up one of the cleaned wine glasses from the drying rack, turning it in his hand. "And these, 2 different lipsticks." He put the glass down, meeting her eyes. "Brenda, what's been going on here?" Her defensiveness seemed to deflate, replaced by something fragile. Her shoulders slumped. She looked away towards the window, then back at him. I, I've been lonely, Ethan, so lonely. You're always gone. Singapore, London, New York. It's just me and the kids all the time." Her voice cracked. "I made a mistake." The word hung in the air, heavy and loaded. Ethan felt a cold dread spread through his chest. "A mistake? What kind of mistake, Brenda? What happened?" He walked closer, forcing her to look at him. "Tell me the truth. Why were you heartbroken? Why was the house a disaster? Who was here?" Brenda took a deep, shaky breath, her eyes welling up. It was just talking, at first. Someone to talk to, someone who was here." She paused, the words catching in her throat. "I felt neglected, so alone." "An emotional affair?" Ethan asked, the phrase tasting bitter on his tongue. He had always known their marriage had its challenges, the long distances, the demands of his job. But this? She nodded, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "Yes, and then it became more." She wouldn't meet his eyes, her gaze fixed on the pattern of the kitchen tiles. "It was physical, Ethan. It was a neighbor. He lives just a few streets over." The words hit him like a physical blow. A neighbor. Someone close. Someone who saw him leave, saw him come home. The cold knot in his stomach tightened, a familiar pain, but this was different. This cut deeper than any professional downfall, any ruined investment. This was his home, his family, his wife. "Under our roof?" Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. "With Kyle and Sarah in the house?" The image of his children, oblivious, playing just feet away from their mother's betrayal, made him sick. Brenda sobbed, covering her face with her hands. I know it's terrible. I've hated myself for it. I don't know who I am anymore. I've lost myself." Her voice was muffled, thick with shame. Ethan stood there, unable to move, unable to speak. The truth, stark and brutal, lay between them. His mind raced, not with anger, but with a profound, chilling hurt. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw a stranger, ravaged by guilt. He needed air. He needed space. He couldn't process this. Not now, not here. I need a minute," he managed to say, his voice strained. He turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving Brenda weeping amidst the sterile order he had imposed on their shattered home. The conversation ended, the silence that followed thick with unresolved tension and unspoken pain. The days that followed Brenda's confession were marked by a suffocating silence. Kyle and Sarah, usually boisterous and full of questions, had become noticeably quiet. They ate their cereal in the mornings with their heads down, their eyes darting between their parents, sensing the shift in the air. Ethan tried to maintain a normal routine, making breakfast, driving them to school, but the tension in the house was a palpable third presence, casting a long shadow over every interaction. He felt like he was walking on glass, his own emotional turmoil and the gnawing anxiety of his investment pressing down on him. Brenda tried too to bridge the growing gap with the kids. She'd offer to help with homework or suggest a game, but her guilt hung heavy, making her interactions awkward, hesitant. Her laughter, usually bright, sounded forced and brittle. The children noticed, retreating further into themselves. Ethan, needing an outlet, called his sister, Nancy, who lived an hour away. He drove over one afternoon while the kids were at school, leaving Brenda alone in the house. He sat in Nancy's familiar kitchen, the smell of baking bread comforting and alien at the same time. He recounted everything, the firing, the flight, the house, the lipstick, the confession. Nancy listened, her face growing serious. "Oh, Ethan," she said softly, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. That's, that's a lot for one man to take. And the kids, how are they doing?" "They're quiet," Ethan admitted, feeling the familiar ache in his chest. "Too quiet. They know something's wrong, they just don't know what." Nancy nodded. "They always do. Kids are smart. You need to focus on them, Ethan. Keep their world as normal as you can. And Brenda, she needs help. Real help. Not just an apology." He left Nancy's house feeling a slight release of pressure, though the weight remained. Brenda, meanwhile, had begun to talk about therapy. She looked drawn, her eyes often red-rimmed from crying. "I don't know what to do, Ethan," she'd confessed one evening, her voice barely audible. "I think I need to talk to someone. I need to understand why." But Ethan, feeling adrift, found his own escape in the cold, hard numbers of his investment. He spent hours hunched over his new laptop tracking the aquaculture stock. It fluctuated, sometimes gaining a point, sometimes losing two. Each tick up was a surge of hope, each tick down a stab of fear. It was a lifeline or it was a noose, and he couldn't look away. One evening during dinner, the silence at the table was suffocating. Kyle pushed his peas around his plate, while Sarah picked at her chicken. Brenda tried to initiate small talk about school, but her voice was strained, and the conversation died quickly. Ethan kept his gaze fixed on his plate, the food tasting like ash. Finally, Sarah, her small voice cutting through the tension, looked up at him. "Dad, why are you and Mom always sad?" The question hit him, sharp and unexpected. He glanced at Brenda, whose face immediately crumpled. He cleared his throat. It's been a tough time, sweetie. Dad's job changed, and sometimes grown-ups just get sad." When he hated the vague, incomplete answer. But what could he say? "Your mom had an affair, and I gambled all our money." Brenda, still teary-eyed, spoke up, her voice trembling. "I'm just worried, honey. Worried about everything." She looked at Ethan, a desperate plea in her eyes. "I'm so afraid of losing you all. Losing this. Losing our family." Her words hung in the air, underscoring the precariousness of their situation. He saw the children's faces, reflecting a confusion that was rapidly turning into distress. Soon after, the children began acting out. Kyle, who was usually well-behaved, started arguing with his teachers. Sarah, who loved school, cried before bedtime, often about nothing he could discern. Ethan watched them, a grim realization settling in. Brenda's actions, and his own subsequent absorption in his financial gamble, were having a profound, damaging ripple effect, pulling their children into the heart of their silent storm. The heavy air in the house became suffocating. Ethan couldn't endure the vague answers any longer. One evening after the children were in bed, he found Brenda in the kitchen, staring out the window into the darkness. "Who was it, Brenda?" he asked, his voice low, controlled, but with an edge that hadn't been there before. "You said he was a neighbor. Give me a name." She flinched, turning slowly. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed. "Ethan, please, what does it matter?" "It matters," he bit out, stepping closer. "It matters everything. Who was it? Someone I know? Someone who comes to our barbecues?" He knew the answer before she spoke, a sickening certainty. Brenda swallowed hard, her gaze dropping to the floor. It was Mark Davis from 2 streets over. We, we saw him at the community picnic. Mark Davis. Ethan knew Mark. A quiet man, always seemed pleasant enough. He'd even exchanged pleasantries with him at the grocery store just a few weeks ago, before Singapore. The betrayal tightened its grip, a cold fist around his heart. A mutual acquaintance. The humiliation felt complete. How long, Brenda? Ethan's voice was hoarse with suppressed rage and hurt. How long has this been going on? What else aren't you telling me? Tears streamed down her face. A few months. It started after your London trip. I was just so lonely, Ethan. You were gone so much. I felt like I was doing everything alone. I just wanted someone to see me, to pay attention. Her voice was a broken whisper. Ethan stared at her, the woman he'd married, the mother of his children, and he struggled to reconcile her with the person standing before him, confessing such a profound deceit. The woman who wanted attention, who felt neglected. Had he been so blind, so consumed by his work, by the next big deal, that he'd missed her unraveling? Attention? He scoffed, the word laced with bitterness. So you found attention with a neighbor. What about me, Brenda? What about us? Was any of it real? Our marriage, our life? The questions tumbled out, raw and painful, chipping away at the foundation of everything he thought he knew. Brenda rushed forward, reaching for his hands, but he pulled away. Please, Ethan, don't say that. I love you, I do. This was a terrible mistake. I regret it every single day. I'm so sorry. Please, can we fix this? Can you ever forgive me? Her voice was choked with desperation. Forgiveness. The word felt hollow, distant. He saw her pleading face, her genuine remorse, and a part of him, the part that remembered their shared history, their laughter, their dreams, wanted to reach out. But the other part, the part that felt the sting of Mark Davis's name, the image of those 2 wine glasses, refused. The argument escalated, moving beyond the affair itself, touching on years of unspoken resentments, misconnections, and the slow, insidious drift that had brought them to this precipice. Suddenly, a small voice from the hallway cut through their heated words. Mommy? Daddy? What's wrong? It was Kyle, his face pale, Sarah peeking out from behind him, her eyes wide with fear. They had overheard. The sound of their children's distress pierced through Ethan's anger, leaving only a cold, sickening awareness. He felt the suffocating weight of everything, his ruined career, the desperate gamble of his entire fortune, and now his crumbling marriage, the silent tears of his children. It was all crashing down. He looked at Brenda, then at his kids, his options swirling in a chaotic storm. Leave, walk away from the wreckage, try to pick up the pieces against all odds, or seek some kind of bitter retribution. As the consequences of choices multiply and entangle, stick around to the end to see how life's costly choices unfold. The argument with Brenda, with Kyle and Sarah overhearing, had shattered any pretense of fragile calm. The raw emotion, the undeniable truth of Brenda's betrayal, fueled Ethan's recklessness. He couldn't control his marriage, but he could control this. He saw the aquaculture stock dip again, a fresh opportunity. His mind, already frayed, latched onto the idea. Double down, go all in. He called his broker, a contact he'd cultivated in Singapore, and arranged for a substantial loan against his remaining, rapidly diminishing personal assets. He poured every cent of it into the falling stock. The digital transfer was swift, irreversible. He spent the next sleepless nights hunched over his new laptop, the screen's blue light illuminating the dark circles under his eyes. The stress of financial ruin, a cold, hard dread, compounded the marital agony that festered beneath the surface. Each flickering number on the screen was a heartbeat, a hope, or a harbinger of disaster. Brenda, despite his coldness, tried to offer support. She'd bring him coffee, a plate of food he barely touched. Ethan, you need to sleep, she'd say, her voice soft, tentative. Let's talk. About us. About what we're going to do. But he'd just nod vaguely, his gaze fixed on the churning market data, pushing her away without words. He was consumed by the gamble, by the desperate need to claw back control. Then came the call from Hank, his father. Son, you sound tired. Hank's gruff voice filled the phone. Everything all right? Brenda's still doing poorly. Hank, sensing his son's distress, was still unaware of the full extent of the problem, the job loss, the affair, the reckless investment. Ethan forced a laugh that felt hollow. Just a little jet lag, Dad, and work's been busy. A new project. Brenda's a little down, but she'll be fine. He lied, maintaining a fragile facade of control, of normalcy, something he desperately needed to believe himself. It felt like another layer of deceit in an already crumbling life. The stock market continued its volatile dance. Minor gains would appear, a flicker of hope, only to be swallowed by sudden plunges. It was a relentless test of his resolve, a digital torment. He knew deep down the extreme nature of his actions. He was either going to make a fortune, a comeback that would silence all the critics, or he was going to lose everything, his family, his future, his dignity. There was no middle ground left. Brenda, still trying, would approach him, her face etched with concern. Ethan, about us, the kids, we need to talk about our future. Reconciliation. But her words were distant, muffled by the relentless hum of the laptop, the constant refresh of numbers. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the screen. In rare moments of lucidity, usually in the quiet hours before dawn, he felt intense regret, a crushing wave of self-doubt. What had he done? His financial recklessness seemed almost a mirror to Brenda's betrayal. Both were gambles, high stakes, a desperate reaching for something, control, attention, validation, that had spiraled out of control. Then a message popped up on his phone, an email from Frank Olson. The subject line was terse. Aquaculture stock update. The body of the email contained a single link to a financial news article highlighting the continued decline of the company, ending with a brief, pointed line. Thought you'd want to know, Ethan, still trending downwards. It was a gloating, scornful confirmation from his former employer, a clear message that Frank was still watching, still judging. The message hardened Ethan's resolve, cementing his obsession. He withdrew further from his family, becoming a ghost in his own house, his focus solely on the screen, the numbers, the desperate hope for a turnaround. His health, once robust, began to suffer. Lack of sleep etched deeper lines on his face. He ate sporadically, whatever he could grab, often forgetting meals entirely. The parallels between his reckless investment and Brenda's betrayal grew starker, both gambles taken out of desperation, both with potentially devastating consequences. The whispers started subtly, a lowered voice at the grocery store, a quick glance away when Brenda walked into the school pickup line. She felt it, a cold, pervasive judgment. Friends, once close, began to distance themselves. Playdates for the children were less frequent. Acquaintances who used to chat easily now offered only polite, strained nods. Her reputation, once solid in their small Midwestern community, was visibly crumbling around her. She was the subject of hushed conversations, the woman who had brought shame to their quiet street. Her relationship with Kyle and Sarah, already strained, worsened. They were quieter, more observant. They watched her, their young eyes filled with a confusion she couldn't alleviate, a hurt she couldn't explain away. When she tried to hug them, they often stiffened, a subtle withdrawal that cut her deeper than any angry word. Her guilt and shame deepened, pulling her into recurring bouts of depression. The isolation became profound, a heavy blanket that smothered her. She spent days listless, staring out windows, the vibrant world outside seeming to mock her inner turmoil. She tried still to reach Ethan. She'd approach him in the evenings, when he paused from staring at his laptop screen, pleading for his forgiveness, for a chance to talk about their future. Ethan, please, she'd begin, her voice raw. I know I messed up. I just want to fix this. But he remained guarded, his eyes cold, distant. His heart seemed hardened, not just by her betrayal, but by the relentless, invisible pressure of his financial gamble. He would barely acknowledge her, retreating further behind his screen into his own private world of numbers and risk. The thought of leaving town began to take root, a desperate fantasy of escaping the judgment, the broken home, the constant reminder of her mistakes. Just pack a bag, take the kids, and disappear somewhere new, where no one knew her name or her past. But the thought was fleeting. impractical. This was their home. These were her children. She finally acted on Nancy's advice, seeking help. She found a local support group, a small circle of women, all carrying their own burdens of regret and fractured relationships. She also began individual counseling, slowly, painstakingly, unraveling the threads of loneliness and neglect that had led her astray. It was agonizing work, but it was a start. Brenda started taking concrete steps to prove her remorse. She was more present with Kyle and Sarah, even if their responses were hesitant. She read to them, helped them with their homework, made their favorite meals, trying to bridge the gap with consistent, unwavering love. She had a difficult conversation with Hank, Ethan's father, during one of her rare visits to his farm. He listened patiently, his weathered face solemn. "Brenda," he said, his voice gruff but kind, "Ethan's a good boy, always has been. What you did, it's a hard thing, but people make mistakes. We all do. You gotta earn your way back, though. Show him you mean it." His disappointment was evident, but so was a glimmer of understanding. The hardest step was confronting Mark Davis. She found him at the grocery store pushing a cart and walked directly up to him. His eyes widened in surprise, then quickly dropped. "Mark," she said, her voice steady, firm. "This stops everything. It was a mistake and it's caused too much pain. Don't ever contact me again." She turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, frozen amidst the aisles. The encounter was brief, uncomfortable, but necessary. It was a severing of ties, a line drawn in the sand. As the days turned into weeks, Brenda began to truly realize the price of her actions. It wasn't just Ethan's coldness or the children's quiet distance. It was a deep personal and social cost, a wound that might never fully heal. The once bright tapestry of her life was now frayed, stained by regret, and she knew she had only herself to blame. The screen, once a torment, now glowed with triumphant green. Ethan stared at the numbers, his eyes burning, but no longer from fatigue. The aquaculture stock had finally, spectacularly turned around. A major buyout offer, unexpected and aggressive, had driven the share price soaring, far past his break-even point, far past anything he could have dared to hope for. He watched as his offshore account swelled, the digits multiplying into a sum so vast it almost didn't seem real. He had won. He had proven them all wrong. The vindication was immense, a bitter taste of triumph against Frank Olson and his former firm. He had gained a massive profit, far exceeding his wildest expectations. He was rich, wealthier than he had ever been. Yet the financial triumph felt profoundly hollow. He sat in his quiet home, the silence thick with the unspoken tension of a broken family. Brenda was in the other room, likely with the kids, a distance between them that no amount of money could bridge. His emotional emptiness was a deeper, more persistent ache than any financial anxiety had ever been. A cold, calculating thought began to form. Wrongful termination. He had the proof now, the undeniable evidence of his foresight, his judgment. The thought of legal action, of bringing J.P. Morgan to its knees, simmered. It was revenge, pure and simple, and it felt like the only clear path he had left. He arranged a meeting with Frank Olson. It was back in conference room 3, the same sterile room where his career had been summarily ended. Frank sat opposite him, Gary Jenkins again by his side. Frank offered a tight, professional smile. "Ethan, heard you wanted to talk." Ethan didn't smile back. He didn't raise his voice. He just opened his laptop and turned the screen towards them, displaying the staggering profit margin, the undeniable success of his aquaculture investment. The numbers spoke for themselves. Frank's face went slack, his professional smile dissolving into stunned silence. Gary, usually so composed, looked visibly shaken. The triumph was complete. Frank Olson, the man who had called his vision wishful thinking, was speechless, utterly defeated by the cold, hard numbers. Ethan watched him, feeling a satisfaction that was both sweet and deeply disturbing. This was his revenge. But as he left the building, walking out into the bustling Chicago streets, a free and wealthy man, the feeling quickly faded. He had won financially. Yes, he had proven his critics wrong. But in his relentless pursuit of revenge and wealth, he had lost something irreplaceable. He looked at his phone. No eager messages from Brenda, no cheerful calls from his kids. The silence was louder than any cheer. Brenda, when he returned home, saw the change in him, the quiet triumph in his eyes. He told her in clipped, factual sentences about the stock, the buyout, the astronomical profit. She listened, her face unreadable. She recognized his financial success, but she also saw the immense emotional toll it had taken. His revenge, she understood, had come at an unspeakable cost, leaving him victorious, but utterly alone. He began to consider his options. He had more than enough to start over, anywhere in the world, somewhere new, away from the painful memories of his ruined marriage, his shattered family. He could buy a new life. But what kind of life? Kyle and Sarah, sensing another shift, were confused. Their father was still distant, still absorbed in his thoughts, despite the vague, upbeat explanation of a big success. They didn't understand the numbers, only the continued emotional chasm. Ethan reflected on the morality of his choices. He had chosen the gamble, the professional vindication, the cold, hard numbers, over the emotional turmoil of his home. He had chosen to invest in a distant aquaculture company rather than invest in his struggling marriage. He had won his bet against Frank Olson, but in doing so he had sacrificed his family, his peace, perhaps even a part of his soul. The price of revenge was far higher than he had ever anticipated. The conversation with Brenda was raw, stripped bare of pretense. We sat in the living room, the quiet hum of the house a stark contrast to the turmoil inside us. We talked about Kyle and Sarah, their silent suffering, the impact of our brokenness. Forgiveness, I realized, was not a switch to be flipped. My own recklessness, the desperate gamble, blurred the lines of judgment. Brenda spoke of commitment, of rebuilding, her voice earnest. Marriage counseling seemed a distant, fragile hope, but we agreed to try. I set up funds for the kids, securing their futures, a tangible act of responsibility amidst the emotional wreckage. I finally called Hank and Nancy, telling them everything, the full, ugly truth. They listened, offering quiet support, no easy answers. We knew the scars wouldn't disappear, that some things might never fully heal. But we would try to pick up the pieces, one cautious step at a time. Looking out at the familiar, expansive Midwestern fields, I understood the bittersweet nature of survival, the complex tapestry of morality woven into every choice.